Imagine you're walking down a long dirt road. It's the same path your parents have travelled and they love telling you about how much easier the journey is today, and that all you need to do is keep walking. The milestones stretch out in front of you, landmarks that your parents reached as part of their journey, but as the years go by and the road stretches out, they just seem further and further away. Sometimes a storm blows in and you have to wait for it to pass, or the road turns to mud and it feels like you're trudging through a swamp. Eventually you look up and you realise that you've gotten no further than you were a day, a month, or a year ago. There's a very good reason Gen Z is the most apathetic, cynical, and detached generation in living history. Just look at the hand they've been dealt. It's so much harder today to find a meaningful relationship, buy a home, start a family, get a good job, and generally live your life. With each rung on the ladder getting further apart, you can't blame people for doubting if the climb is worth it. Participation in society used to be based on an underlying deal. If you paid attention at school, worked hard, and treated people with respect, eventually everything would fall into place. Society had set structures which guaranteed that the people who followed the rules would actually get something out of it. A home, a family, a purpose, something which maybe added meaning to their lives. But over the past few decades, all of that was systematically stripped away. It was the lie we were told growing up. Everyone has to grow up. But the breaking of that illusion has been particularly traumatic to Gen Z. As children, we were told we could do anything, and that the world was a place where all of this would come true. But the reality that we actually grew into was far from a paradise, and the way we learnt about it was like diving straight into the deep end. Just a few hundred years ago, the things people learnt and knew about the world fit neatly together. People learnt about the world from the people around them, and they built their own beliefs based entirely on their own small world. Structure and traditions were handed down to you and your community. And then it all got thrown into chaos. The Enlightenment and the scientific revolution destroyed the foundations of these religious and traditional worldviews. People's worldviews expanded, and their lives got more complicated. As religion lost its dominant role, ideology came in to replace it. As the world slowly modernized, traditional communities struggled to survive, and traditional structures in society were replaced by ideological ones. People's allegiance and place shifted from their community to their nation state and the ideas they stood for. Even into the 20th century though, your view of the world could still remain consistent. Most people still had a clear path for their lives, and a clear way of thinking about life shared among the people they knew. The internet and access to mass media from across the world has blown all of this away. Instead of one belief system dominating our lives, there's thousands of false desires for us to pick and choose from. Instead of consistent shared experience, we've been exposed to millions of different people's subjective views on life. By the time they're 12 years old, kids today have been plunged headfirst into the shifting sea of ideas. Millions of judgments and opinions about what's right or wrong, how you should act, and what's either desirable or disgusting. It's easy for people to retreat into this world of information. The philosopher and sociologist Jean Baudrillard describes this world as hyperreality, a sort of world beyond worlds, made up of meanings behind objects and people rather than what they actually are. Things and concepts which exist in the real world like beauty, tragedy, virtue, and vice all get warped and maximized. Beautiful people become impossibly perfect with computer editing and filters. Every crisis from around the world is suddenly right in front of you until it's quickly replaced by something else. The craziest outbursts and the most violent altercations rise to the top. These forces are most noticeable in people's sexual identity and preferences. Overstimulation and seeing all of your desires digitalized eventually gets boring for people. The more immersed in hyperreality they become, the harder it is for them to quench these desires. Everything becomes more and more extreme and detached from actual reality. Baudrillard describes this hyperreal world as being far more intense and ecstatic than the real world we live in. People find themselves fleeing the desert of the real for this digital world of symbols and subjectivity. But even if you don't get so caught up in hyperreality, it still changes the world around you. People's values and beliefs shift to reflect their ever-changing window into public opinion. Objects and people gain value according to how they're regarded in this hyperreality, as opposed to their actual value. They become symbols. Eventually, as we're seeing today, the hyperreal world begins to replace the real one entirely. If people act based on hyperreality and social status within it, then it starts to dominate life itself. Parts of life like fashion, which were already based on symbolism and underlying meanings, show the most severe effects of this. It's only in a hyperreal world that the brand Supreme could make a literal brick with their logo carved into it, which would then later sell online for over $1,000. Living in this world, and especially growing up in it, makes it much harder for people to find actual meaning. When everything only has value based on shifting opinions and an invisible social hierarchy, nothing has any permanent meaning behind it. This hyperreality becomes all the more tempting when you put down the phone and take a real look at today's world. Following the advice of the people who came before us doesn't work too well. The world has changed so much in recent history that the roadmap they followed just doesn't work anymore. Finding someone special, settling down, buying a home and having children just isn't feasible for most people. and the root of the problem is economic. When you look at what it takes to reach these integral parts of life today compared to 20 or 50 years ago, it puts it all into perspective. Let's start with the US. Here's the home price to median household income ratio over time. It measures how many years it would take, saving all the money the average American household earns, to buy a family home. From 1965 to 2000, it hovered around 3.5 to 4.5, a healthy ratio that meant that homes were usually within the reach for most people, which isn't the case today at all. After years of stagnating wages, greedy bankers playing the system, and a global pandemic, we're closing in on 8. It would take 8 years of wages to buy just one home. The UK is even worse off on average. They blew past 8 years in 2015. Now it would take 9 years of wages to buy one house. In the big cities, it's even worse. To buy the average home in LA and comfortably pay the mortgage, you need to make over $220,000. In New York, the median house price is equivalent to over 10 years of income for the average household. A London family would need a staggering 16 years of uninterrupted wages to buy a house outright. The cities that young people move to for work, and higher wages end up being far harder to get a foothold in. And all of this is so important because owning a home is the foundation for a traditional life. Living paycheck to paycheck and paying off someone else's mortgage means there's barely a safety net at all. It's dangerous for people to live their lives because it's just too expensive in our society. Adding in childcare costs makes it clear why very few people are even having children anymore. Is it really a surprise the West is facing a giant population collapse? Of course, it isn't just housing here. Inflation has meant that everything's gotten so much more expensive. Corporate profiteering and price gouging haven't helped either. But as everything has gotten more expensive, wages have continued to stagnate for most. Since 1979, the bottom 90% of the US saw their income rise by around 24% adjusting for inflation. Meanwhile, it doubled for the top 1% of the country. Hyper-reality has distracted people from this. They still know it's happening, everyone's feeling the effects. But with the constant assault of useless information you're powerless to do anything about, it just gets swallowed up by the constant cycle. It acts as a release valve for people's rightful outrage. Real anger and emotions that would have been converted into real action end up in cyberspace instead. There they join the billions of other opinions and fade away into the background noise. Things go by so fast we're unable to process them. Humans just not built to deal with so much at once, and as a result, hyperreality all seems like a blur. Like you're traveling through it all so fast that you only get a sense of the underlying emotions. The algorithms manipulate this further and push content that makes people feel self-conscious or negative to the top. It doesn't help that we're going through a global crisis right now, the brink of a third world war, economic catastrophe. The world's a mess, and Gen Z knows they're the ones who are going to have to clean it all up. And so applying Baudrillard's work to our world today illuminates the reasons behind how absurd and unreal it can all seem. The replacement of reality with hyperreality shifted the focus of everything to social status. Money's a good example. Generally, people's wages and the amount of money they earned was linked to the quality of their labor and how productive they were. Today, how much you earn is entirely based on your social status within the system. It's been to the benefit of both CEOs and the top OnlyFans models. They both earn their money not through the quality of their work or what they produce, but through their position at the top of the hierarchy. The focus on speculative value, as opposed to real value, has aided scam artists and snake oil salesmen as well. It's only in our modern world that Sam Bankman-Fried could convince top hedge funds and millions of people to invest in a Ponzi scheme. The result of all of this is a society which puts far more focus on the optics of equality whilst becoming even more rigidly ordered and stratified. Movement up the ladder becomes even harder despite the appearance of a constant march towards a more liberal society. So how do you survive in a world like this? Well, there's a few different routes people take. Lots of people detach entirely, completely leaving the desert of the real and retreating entirely into hyperreality. It isn't an active choice, of course. The passive nature of consumption just goes hand in hand with the inaction of depression. Simple things like exercise and living life become harder and harder to do. As you sink into these lower levels, the nasty loop is that doing these things is what you need in the first place to break you out, but the more depressed someone is, the more difficult they become. There isn't one single cure to this, or some collection of words that will solve it. Everyone's journey is their own, and what people do have is their own personal strength and the people around them. Finding a natural reason to break free and carry on is completely different though. It's something philosophers have tried to solve for thousands of years, with middling results. Today, there's a few general approaches people try to use to find some sort of meaning. One approach has been championed by people like Andrew Tate to embrace hyperreality to the fullest. If social status is all that matters, then why not give in and make it the meaning behind your life as well? Andrew Tate calls this breaking out of the Matrix. But really, it's more similar to what Cypher did in the film than Neo. When he portrayed Neo and decided to go back into the Matrix, he represented embracing hyperreality. He accepted that even if the steak he was eating and the life he was living was fake and meaningless, he might might as well enjoy the pleasures of it. Building social status, buying Bugattis, living in Dubai, having empty encounters with multiple women might sound like a 15-year-old boy's dream life, but in reality, that life never existed in the first place. It's an idealized image with little basis in true reality, expressed through heavily edited snippets and highlights. And even if you could live a life like that, it wouldn't add any real meaning to your life. You have no soul, you have no consciousness, you're not connected to any deeper purpose within inside of you. There will always be a faster and more expensive car to buy or a larger mansion to own. Treating everything and everyone like an object of social status also justifies awful and abusive behavior. Any belief system that reduces people into something else inevitably leads to tragedy. Whilst embracing hyperreality isn't the answer, rejecting it completely isn't either. It would sound ideal to just take your loved ones and go live in a cabin somewhere. You'd be free to live an authentic life in nature, but it just isn't very realistic. Most people can't afford to just leave society, and even if they can, it's hard to convince others to join you. And by cutting out a community, you're cutting out one of the most important needs in Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Deleting social media might be a less drastic solution, but you'll still be living in a hyperreal society. Detaching from life and society in these ways might be the right option for some. For others, it's life denying. It's a decision born out of the fear of suffering what society has become. Would it not be better to work within society and at least try and make it a bit better, rather than just leaving it to the rest of the world? When the world faced a similar crisis of meaning 150 years ago, Nietzsche saw that the only escape from nihilism was to create your own values. They can't be based on hyperreality, and as create a collection of other people's experiences. The only thing that actually exists is your own viewpoint and your own perspective. That world is the only one you have even limited control over. Nietzsche believed that the highest values we can create come from the innate human will to power, and what he meant by this is still up for debate, but it doesn't mean simply forcing everything and everyone into submission. Instead, one interpretation of this will to power is how well you can shape the world around you. To have power in your life, the better you can make it, and the more it suits your own personal purposes, the more power you have. So analyze everything you read, hear, or see that could impact your decisions. Think about the motivations behind the person saying it. Decide whether it aligns with your own personal world and whether it can make it better. If it can, embrace it and see what happens. If not, discard it. The world is going through a crisis and it'll need strong, principled people to see it through. The only thing you can do though is worry about your own world and the people around you. The rest is up to fate. It's times of crises that breed strong people. Make sure you're one of them. But if you're interested in really finally defeating your social media addiction once and for all, I think you'll find my community of interest. You see, I'm actively working with like-minded people in my school to destroy internet addiction, with one-to-one calls and posts from me personally, where I help you every week move away from a life of constant distractions, where you can recover your time back. In the community, you'll also be with a small tribe of us, where we go into way more detail on overcoming this problem. So if you're interested in this, there's a link in the description below. On YouTube, I've already discussed many of the challenges that we will face, like loneliness, meaninglessness, and the pitfalls of modernity. And having gone through all of these problems myself, I have personally used the best philosophers, psychologists, and sociologists to overcome all of this and build the channel that you're watching today. However, the video format here does have some limitations, as I've always wanted a more personal connection with my audience, where we can have deeper discussions where I can know you by name, and we get to really know each other as people, which is why I have launched the Moon School of Living, which isn't just another online community. It's hosted on School, free from trolls, shitposts, and any other garbage. It's a premium environment with high value members, where you can expect at least 3 weekly calls, where we discuss topics like modernity, philosophy, and how I make these YouTube videos, where all sessions are recorded for later access. We've also got a course on video editing and upcoming ones on modernity, philosophy, YouTube, money, and so many more, where you'll be a part of a close-knit community of us where we connect with like-minded people, away from our broken habitus. We've already had some great calls on this whole power structure thing, ayahuasca, internet addiction, and personalized YouTube reviews where I literally go over aspiring YouTube creators, giving them one-to-one advice. It's $99 a month, and I know this is expensive, but it ensures a high-quality experience for serious learners and a much smaller community for all of us. If you're skeptical or find it too pricey at the moment, just continue enjoying my regular content and please don't worry about this. But if you feel the community is for you, there's a 7-day refund and cancelling is hassle-free. So if my content's resonated with you and you've enjoyed this video, imagine being part of a tight-knit community of us, where I personally know you and celebrate your progress. If you're interested, just check the link in the description below.